With this lecture, we enter the social and imaginative world of the Anglo-Saxon peoples. In my last lecture, I called attention to the ways in which the geography and the history of the British Isles helped shape Old English as a language. And I also called attention to the importance of dialect, a point I'd like to stress again. The idea that regional dialects become national standards. And the paradox that the earliest English poem that we have, Cædmon's Hymn, with which I will conclude this lecture, originally appears in the Northumbrian dialect and then is later translated into the West Saxon dialect. This relationship between dialect and power, dialect and culture will become one of the central themes of this course, not simply for the Anglo-Saxon period, but for the Middle Ages, Renaissance, modern Britain, and America as well. Now, when we look at Anglo-Saxon culture, we're looking primarily at verbal artifacts. And as a course in the history of the English language, rather than a course, say, in architecture or in archaeology, we need to see how these words, in effect, build structures for the mind. The Anglo-Saxon peoples, like many Germanic-speaking peoples, have a tense relationship, if you like, between the loan word and the native coinage. Old English resisted the importation of words. That is, it tended not to borrow words from Latin, but rather coined words based on its own rootstock. But this is not to say that there were no loan words at all in Old English. When scholars talk about periods of borrowing in Old English or in the Germanic languages, they generally refer to two broad periods. The one is the continental, and the other is the insular. The continental period of borrowing is that period before the Germanic peoples split up, the period on the European continent when they are in contact with a living Roman imperial and cultural presence during the first centuries AD. Words that come into the Germanic languages at this point really survive in all the Germanic languages. And we need to look at them to see how they have survived in modern English as well. What's very interesting is to see how they are, in some sense, very much Roman words. To start, there is the word street. Now, it's a common expression that all roads lead to Rome. And all roads lead to Rome because, quite frankly, it was the Romans who built the roads. And the Latin word strata, which means street, this is a particular word that shows up in virtually every language that the Romans came in contact with. Now, from the point of view of the history of language, it looks suspiciously like the street words, street, strasa, stratum, strada. It looks suspiciously as if these were cognates. In other words, as if these were all words that descended from an original. What they descend from is not an original shared Indo-European root. What they descend from is a Latin word that is consciously borrowed into the Germanic and other European languages. There's a wonderful moment in the great epic Beowulf, probably written down about the year 1000 in Old English, when Beowulf shows up to rid King Hrothgar's court of the monster Grendel. And they ride on the road to Hrothgar's hall. And the Old English poet says, Stret was stan fach, that the street was stone paved. It's very clear that what the poet is evoking here is a world in which Germanic peoples built their lives on Roman ruins. And just as I mentioned in my earlier lecture, how Germanic or Anglo-Saxon halls would be built on the ruins or the foundations of older Roman villas, so too the Germanic streets or roads were the old Roman roads. So the word street in Old English connotes, almost uniquely, a great paved surface. And that's a good place to begin with the continental borrowings. Now, the Romans built the roads because they had to get their armies everywhere. And so it's words for war that are among the earliest borrowings from Latin into the Germanic languages. And these include words like camp, which originally means a fortification, wall, mile, and pit. They are words for trade. The Latin word kaupo means a small tradesman. And this enters the Germanic languages as cheap in English or kaufen in German. Just as an aside, in the Scandinavian languages, if you were a tradesman, you were in Icelandic or in Old Norse, you were a kaupmann. And if you had a haven or a port, you would go to Kaupmannahofen, that is, the haven or the port for the tradesman. And Kaupmannahofen is the old Scandinavian word for the city that becomes Copenhagen. The Romans, of course, were great winemakers and wine traders. They were great minters of money. And so words like wine and pound and mint are old Roman Latin words that come into the Germanic languages in the continental period. Words for specialty foods, cheese, pepper, butter, plum, prune, and pea. Words for architecture, like chalk, copper, pitch, and tile. These are, if you like, the distinctive features of high Roman culture. And they enter the Germanic languages in the continental period and spread throughout the later Germanic tongues. Words for rulership. Now, the Latin word Caesar was in fact pronounced in Roman Latin as Kaiser. And of course, you can now hear it as the German Kaiser. But it's also borrowed into the Slavic languages where it becomes the Russian Tsar. So Tsar and Kaiser are both words that descend from an original Latin borrowing. Kaiser, Caesar. Even in the case where you're talking about not simply the Germanic languages, but all of the languages of the peoples that the Romans came in contact with. Now, during the period after the Angles and the Saxons moved to the continent, there were still contacts with Latin speech and Latin writing. Now, these are not from Roman imperial or commercial environments. These are from the newer Latin religious concepts. Constantine the Great, the emperor of Rome, was crowned emperor in York. And Constantine, after he returned in the early 4th century, was the first emperor to declare Christianity as the official religion of the empire. So by the time the pagan Anglo-Saxons, if you like, came to the British Isles, they were coming to a Roman imperial culture that had been Christian for about a century or a century and a half. And during the 6th and 7th centuries, missionaries from Rome were sent to Northern Europe and to the British Isles to convert the Germanic peoples. And so during the insular, or if you like, island period, after the Angles and the Saxons move, and after the British Isles become, in effect, a Germanic-speaking place, this is the time when the Latin loanwords are words from newer religious concepts and words that the older Celtic-speaking peoples and the Scandinavian-speaking peoples and the Vikings and the Danish raiders all come in. So you have an insular period, if you like, when new words come in. You have words from Celtic and Latin Christianity, borrowed in the 6th and 7th centuries. Words like cross, priest, shrine, rule, school, master, and pupil. You have words from the Scandinavian Germanic languages. That is, the Scandinavians were speaking a Germanic language, just as the Anglo-Saxons were speaking a Germanic language. But the sounds of the languages were different. In particular, the Scandinavian languages would pronounce as sk, sk, or k, k, words that in Old English would have been pronounced sh, sh, and ch. So, for example, you have a set of Germanic words in two different languages pronounced differently. Shirt and skirt. Shirt is Old English, skirt is Scandinavian. They both refer to items of clothing. Church is Old English. Kirk is Scandinavian. Ship is Old English. Skip is Scandinavian, which eventually gives us skipper. Ditch is Old English. Dike is Scandinavian. So here you have words that are within the Germanic family cognate. In other words, they are the same words at root, but they are pronounced differently. And when they come in with different connotations, so that a skirt is different from a shirt and a dike is different from a ditch. Scandinavian languages had a particular set of sounds that Old English didn't have. And these tend to be the hard G sounds. So words like muggy, ugly, egg, and rugged are Scandinavian words. A word like ill is also a Scandinavian word. These are words borrowed into Old English in the Insular period. Words are also borrowed during later Anglo-Saxon culture at the 10th and 11th century, the so-called Benedictine Reform period, when you see more elaborate and learned Latin coming in. And these are words like Antichrist and Apostle and Canticle and Demon, Font, Nocturne, Sabbath, Synagogue, Accent, History, Paper, and so on. Now, Old English, of course, made its own words. It did not simply borrow them, and Old English made words in brilliant and distinctive ways. Here are some of the ways in which Old English made its words. Old English compounded, and there are 4 ways of compounding. The first is called determinative compounding, and it's common to all of the Germanic languages. This kind of compounding forms new words by yoking together 2 normally independent nouns. So here are some examples of Old English words, some of which you can still hear in modern English. A word like earring is a determinative compound, ear-ring. A word like book staff, that's the Old English word for letter, the book staff. This is very similar to the modern German word Buchstab, which means a letter. Determinative compounding can also be used with an adjective and a noun. For example, middan yard, the middle yard. That's the Old English word for the earth, the place we live. And any of you who know Tolkien and his work will know that Tolkien got his Middle Earth from this older Germanic and Old English middle yard. What did a bird have? A bird had federhome, a feather coat or plumage. What did you live in? You lived in a body, but you also lived in it as a bonlocken, a bone locker. My body is my bone locker. Many of these words, especially the last 2 I've given you, make up the unique poetic vocabulary of Old English literature, especially in metaphorical constructions known as kennings. A kenning is a noun metaphor that expresses a familiar object in unfamiliar ways. The sea can be described in many ways. The Hronrad, that's the road of the whale. The Swanrad, the road of the swan. The Gannetus bath, the bath of the gannet. A gannet is a kind of bird. And so this structure of compounding is at the core of the Old English poetic vocabulary. In addition to determinative compounding, there is repetitive compounding, where you bring together words that are very nearly identical or that complement and reinforce each other for special effect. Thus, for example, you have a word like holt woodoo, which just means wood. It's two different words for wood. It's a lot of wood, so it's a forest. One of my favorites is the gangle wèvre, the going about weaver, or the swift moving one. And this is the Old English word for the spider. Third, you have noun adjective formations. Grass green is grass green. Lofgeorn, praise eager. Beowulf is lofgeornost, most eager for praise. Gold roden, gold adorned. In modern English, this form of compounding is revived in such phrases as king emperor, or in military contexts, fighter bomber. Old English also formed lots and lots of words by adding prefixes. As in other Germanic languages, the most common way of creating new words was to stick a prefix on the front. Old English had many prefixes that derived from prepositions and altered the meaning of words in very special ways. For example, come, become, where, beware. And is a prefix that means back or in response to. You can swear, but in Old English you can and swear, answerian, to answer. The word with in Old English doesn't mean accompanying, but it means against. You can stand or you can withstand. To withstand doesn't mean to stand with, it means to stand against. These are the enhancements, if you like, of the verbal resources to describe the world. And so what Old English poets and Old English scholars did is they used the resources of this language, in particular, its ability to make nouns through compounds and through prefixes, to create an elaborate metaphorical and literary language. Now, for the most part, most of the words that I've mentioned are in fact nouns. And as we'll see later in the course, most of the words that survive into modern English from Old English are nouns and pronouns. Old English seems to have had a tendency to develop large classes of noun groups, of synonyms for clarifying concepts, through repetition and restatement, rather than, as we do now, through progressively more distinctive adjectives or adverbs. Old English literary diction is primarily nominal. That is, it hinges on forms of repetition and restatement, using synonyms to bring together various connotations of a thing or idea to enrich its resonance. So let me clarify that when you look at an Old English poem, and you look for, if you like, the literary or the metaphorical or the imaginative, you should not be looking at the modifiers, the adjectives and adverbs. You should be looking at the nouns and the repetitions. All of these issues come together in what may be the earliest English poem, the poem that we know as Caedmon's Hymn. Repetition, forms of compounding, ways of translating Latin concepts into Old English, all of these are at stake in Caedmon's Hymn. I want to tell you the story of Caedmon's Hymn first, and then go into some detail about what it actually was. Sometime between the years 657 and 680, there was a cowherd who lived in Northumbria. That is, you'll remember from the last lecture, the part of England north of the Humber River. And Bede tells this story in his ecclesiastical history. And we're told that one day, Caedmon was unable to participate in the group entertainments shared by the cowherds. For after herding their cows, they would meet in the shed and they would pass around the mead, that is the fermented honey, and they would pass around the harp, and they would drink and they would sing. And Caedmon, who was unable to sing, would leave in embarrassment. And one evening, as Caedmon left us in embarrassment and went back into the shed, an angel came to him. And the angel turned to him and said, and now I will speak in the West Saxon Old English, the translation of Bede's ecclesiastical history, made under the aegis of King Alfred the Great at the end of the 9th century, revised in the early 10th century, where the angel says to Caedmon, "Sing me, Hwathwugu." Sing to me about something. And Caedmon says that he is unable to sing. What should I sing? And the angel says, "Sing me Frumschaft." Sing to me of the creation of the beginning. Sing to me of first things. And so, miraculously, Bede gives us Caedmon's hymn, which I will now read to you in the form that you will find it in almost every textbook and every anthology, in the West Saxon version of the poem as it was transcribed or transformed under the aegis of Alfredian intellectual and cultural life. Here is Caedmon's hymn. Nu schulan heriean, her van riches werd, mertedes mächte, and his modige thank, werk wulderfeder, swahi wundreiche wes, etje drichten, or anstelde. He erest shop, van Bernum, her van Torofa, halig schippend, van middanjerd, mankinnes werd, etje drichten, after Theoda, Thirum Foldan, Freya Elmichtig. What does this poem mean? Here is a translation. Now we shall praise Heaven Kingdom's guardian, the Creator's might and his mind thought, the works of the glory Father, how he, each of his wonders, the eternal Lord, established at the beginning. He first shaped for earth's children heaven as a roof, the holy Creator. Then a middle yard, mankind's guardian, the eternal Lord established afterwards the earth for the people, the Lord Almighty. Now, what is the first thing that we notice about this poem? The first thing that you should notice about this poem, even if you've never heard any Old English before, is that it alliterates. Nu schulden herjan heffenriches werd, mertedes mächte, and his modige thank. Alliteration, that is, the repetition of the initial consonant or vowel in a word, is the constitutive principle of Old English metrics. Indeed, it is the constitutive principle of all Old Germanic poetry. It is not rhyme. It is not the number of syllables that make up the metrical line. Rather, it is the number of stressed syllables that alliterate. So number one is alliteration. Number two, formulae. This is a poem that relies on set formulae or stock phrases to drive home its meaning and effect. It is profoundly repetitive and it is full of synonyms. In terms of vocabulary, we could say that this poem, if you like, offers a lexicon for the divine. Let's go through some of these key words. What is God? God is the Heffenriches Werd. He is the ward, the warden, the guardian of the Reich of heaven, of the kingdom of heaven. He is the method. He is the meter out. That is the one who delivers judgments. Other words, he is the Wulder Father. That is, he is the Father of glory. He is the Drichten. Drichten is a word that means Lord in a secular or political sense, and here it's used in a religious sense. He is the Shippend, the shaper, the creator. He is again the ward. He is again the Drichten. And at the end, he's called Freya Elmichtig, Almighty Freya. Freya is an Old Norse god. So let's, as it were, list our lexicon of the divine. What Caedmon's hymn does is it takes a set of words for divinity, rulership, control, and authority, and applies them in sequence to God. There is only one God, but what Caedmon is revealing are what the linguistic resources are for naming God. What else is going on here? This is a poem that takes the old vocabulary and idioms of pagan mythology and reapplies them to Christian creation. Look at the phrase "Heaven Torofa." That is, how was the world created? God created the earth, we're told, by Earthen Bernum Heaven Torofa, by putting a roof on heaven for the children of the earth. So what you see here is an old recollection of older Scandinavian, pagan Germanic creation myths. Valhalla. Valhalla is the hall of the Val. Val is a Scandinavian word which means the heroic dead taken in battle. Those who choose the Val are the Valkyries, the Valkyries. Valhalla is the hall of the gods. And the great Old Norse creation myths are myths of building a roof for Valhalla. And so what Caedmon's hymn does is it takes this older stock of Germanic, of Scandinavian, of pagan material, and it presses it into the service of Christian doctrine. What else does Caedmon's hymn do? What Caedmon's hymn does as well is it gives us a sense of the newness of Christianity. The Anglo-Saxon peoples had been converted for only a few generations when Caedmon's hymn is shaped. It's the first example we have of an attempt to express Christian conceptions of creation in native Germanic form. And in the process, it shows us something about how the resources of language can be used to translate between English and Latin, between doctrine and poetry. Now, what I also want to say about Caedmon's hymn is something almost mythological. Is this the first English poem? Bede certainly wants it to be. Bede's ecclesiastical history is written in Latin. So how do we have Caedmon's poem? We have Caedmon's poem in two ways. First, we have it in marginal annotations to Bede's Latin manuscript. That is, when Bede tells us about Caedmon's performance and gives us what he says is his Latin translation of the poem, there are manuscripts in which scribes have written the poem in the margins in Old English. So clearly, it was something that circulated orally. The second way we have the poem is in that West Saxon translation of the ecclesiastical history as a whole. So it's very clear, it seems to me, that Caedmon's hymn is important in Anglo-Saxon culture as a document of origin. And so whether or not it is the first English poem, it is certainly presented to us as that poem. We learn three things from studying Caedmon's hymn. We learn how Caedmon translates Christian concepts into the older vocabulary of creation myth and social rulership. Secondly, we see how the forms of oral formulaic and alliterative English verse can express these new Christian ideas. And third, we can see the principles of Old English word formation in the compounds, in the nouns, and in the repetitions that he uses. Words like Hefon reach, kingdom of heaven, Wulder fader, father of glory, Middan yard, this middle yard. To see Caedmon's hymn in context is to see the Old English language pressed into the service now of Christian imagination. And what we'll see in my subsequent lectures is how that Old English language and Christian imagination was in effect subsumed by the conquest of the Normans, by the importation of French, and by a radical set of changes to politics, culture, idiom, and ideology that would change the English language irrevocably.